This lecture has been made available to you courtesy of the American Numismatic Society.
Welcome everyone to this wonderful Friday afternoon long table. What number is this? We're on like 4,000, I think, Ryan, right?
241.
I was close. 241, long table 241. Today we have Dr. Katie Moore, who is an associate professor at UC Santa Barbara in the Department of History, has published many articles on the history of money, colonial currency, counterfeiting, so on and so forth. She just published this wonderful book, Promise to Pay, The Politics and Power of Money in Early America. I highly recommend it. A lot of the photographs are actually from specimens here in the American Numismatic Society. So without further ado, Dr. Moore, it's all yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Thanks, Jesse and Ryan, for inviting me. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen now. So we'll see if this works. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes, but it's also showing kind of your icons down at the bottom of the screen.
Oh, okay. Let's see. Let's see how I can fix that. Okay. Now you just see my cursor, right?
Correct.
Okay. Let me make sure this. Okay, cool. Well, I think we're all set. Thank you again for having me. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm a historian of early American money and political economy, and I'm especially interested in what I call America's first paper currency. I'm just setting my timer here so I don't lose track of time. There we go. America's first paper currency, the bills of credit of Britain's North American colonies, which I discuss in my book at length, Promise to Pay, The Politics and Power of Money in Early America. So today I'd like to talk to you about counterfeiting in early America, what it reveals about the social meaning of America's first paper currency, and what it can tell us about the nature of money more broadly still. So when I began researching this topic, I wasn't sure where it would lead. The few monographs on colonial currency published over the last 75 years, namely Leslie Brock's The Currency of the American Colonies and Joseph Ernst's Money and Politics in America, focused on politics and imperial relations. Social historians interested in money, but not exclusively so, chronicled clashes between debtors and creditors over access to money. Literary and cultural historians, from Jennifer Baker to Jennifer Morgan, discuss the relationship between new forms of money and regimes of value, while economic historians analyzed currency depreciation and inflation in the British colonies. The authoritative numismatic account remains Eric Newman's The Early Paper Money of America. Well, it's only in recent years that historians have begun to consider how early American communities produced money and to what ends, its social meanings and lives, and how it constructed political economies and hierarchies of difference. Shepherding the insights of anthropology, sociology, legal studies, and monetary theory, this exciting new scholarship has revealed early American money to be an imperial project, a language of belonging, and a social network all rolled into one. Early Americans themselves described the political basis of local paper currencies in similar ways to how monetary theorists today talk about the taxes drive money approach to modern money. Taxes drive money. So early American money operated on a fiscal loop. Local elected assemblies, one for each colony, spent money into circulation and they taxed it out. In other words, they made money as they spent money. And then as now, how governments spent money mattered a great deal. And here's how it worked. An assembly would write a money bill for appropriating a sum of money in bills of credit and dictate how it was to be used, paying soldiers' wages and so on. A committee would stamp or print the bills, number and sign them, and deliver them to the treasurer, who would coordinate the payments to the soldiers and other public creditors. But just because the money was paper didn't mean it was empty or its value imaginary. The bill's value was closely tied to the world of blood and sweat and bodies and labors. Simultaneous with writing a money bill, the Assembly would pass a tax act, authorizing the same sum to be levied in the same bills of credit on property or heads over a period of time. Local constables would collect and return the money to the treasurer, who would convene a ritual public burning of the bills, extinguishing the public debts, and the cycle would repeat. In the interim, between taxing and spending, the bills would circulate as cash. Public creditors could hold on to their bills to pay taxes later, or they could pass them on to someone else. That's because the Assembly promised to accept them from anyone holding them in payment of taxes, so everyone recognized them as a standard of value and mode of payment in the community. And this description resonates with legal scholar Christine Dazan's counterhistory of money in early England, showing how monetary tokens held value based on both their taxability and their exchangeability. But how did the assemblies actually impose the money they made? And how did people actually use it? Following bills of credit from treasurer's accounts to private account books, I found that early Americans weren't modern, and neither was their money. Instead, colonial settlers' trust in paper currency pivoted on what they thought of its validity and on their judgments of those who offered it, making the monetary process as much about social trust as about the faith placed in the issuing authority in those legislative assemblies. So the relationships that structured the early modern world, relations based on hierarchy, deference, kinship, reciprocity, and communal obligation, shaped the initial routes money traveled in early America. And as it expanded and came into the hands of ever more people, the social relations that constituted it changed too. Consider Samuel Sewall, a wealthy judge best known for his role in the infamous Salem witch trials, who supported Massachusetts' adoption of bills of credit in 1690 to pay for the failed invasion of Canada that year. He showed his support by volunteering as a commissioner of currency emissions, hand-delivering the bills to company captains, who in turn paid their soldiers, usually after taking a cut. He also used them in his own dealings. 10 shillings from a war widow for some wood, which is seen here. 2 pounds from his tenant for rent. He offered bills for thread, malt, even land. Now, whether the sellers received the bills cheerfully or out of deference to Sewall is unknown, but surely as one of the colony's most prominent settlers, his actions would have been vital in cultivating monetary trust. But regardless of how bills of credit first entered into circulation, they didn't just travel vertically. They at once embedded in close-knit communities of friends and family who already knew and already trusted each other. Colonial account books abound with examples of paper money debts and payment in bills, showing how farmers, weavers, carpenters, and shoemakers worked them into communal credit networks, and complicating older scholarship that views credit and money as conflicting modalities of exchange. And over time, as more and more colonies adopted paper money and issued it in ever greater quantities, as more people from different backgrounds made claims on it, and as it penetrated deep into the social order, its value came to hinge on its horizontality and its anonymity. So paradoxically, the paper money project was eroding the very bonds of obligation and dependency at the base, since bills of credit actually remove that burden of trust from the participants in a bilateral transaction and placed it on the bill's issuer, a critical third party in the process. It's not that the money became abstracted from social relations, but that its meaning went from being embedded in one set of relations to being constituted by another. Thus, liberated, cash could serve as a lifeline for early Americans on the margins, those who struggled to obtain credit because of poverty, legal status, or race, enabling enslaved people and married women to purchase outside of enslavers and husbands' oversight, and servants, apprentices, and sailors to work with employers they didn't know well enough to trust with book debt. Advertisements like this one for runaways show that a small but significant portion made off with bills of credit, and many more stole to escape the rigid confines of poverty and slavery. For them, money was a ticket to the growing world of consumer goods and social advancement, even if true freedom remained out of reach for all but a few. But the money, like the clothing they wore, also marked them for capture, and marginalized persons possessing cash had to guard against charges of impropriety. Even so, historians of slavery have shown that those on the margins took advantage of a monetizing economy, from participating in local lending markets to seeking jobs on ships as sailors and cooks, to growing and selling their own produce. The famous success story is Venture Smith, a young African man enslaved on Long Island who earned money, he later recalled, by cleaning gentlemen's shoes, catching muskrats and raising potatoes, and fishing in the night. Finally saving enough money to buy his freedom, despite being cheated, robbed, and beaten along the way. By the second quarter of the 18th century, the expansion of Atlantic trade, a booming settler population, and the spread of wage labor had dramatically increased the demand for cash in early America. Money sustained life and relationships, and without it, laborers couldn't receive their wages, farmers couldn't sell their crops, shopkeepers couldn't pay their debts to import merchants, and the merchants could not settle theirs with British exporters. It was in this context of growing money demand that colonial governments faced growing restrictions on their very ability to make money. Here's why. With British merchants investing more time, property, and profits in colonial trade, the Crown and Parliament wondered whether inflationary paper bills could be bad for business. Bowing to the merchants, they instructed royal governors to limit paper money emissions or to eliminate their legal tender status. The Crown began vetoing paper money acts, and Parliament initiated an investigation into the colonial currencies, which would culminate in the Currency Acts of 1751 and 1764, regulating and restricting bills of credit. This pair of acts, so often ignored in accounts of the coming of the American Revolution, may well have started the War of Independence. Enter the moneymakers. In every colony, men and women took matters into their own hands when they enlarged the money supply in the shadow of the law. And for the most part, they got away with it. They got away with it for three main reasons. And so I'd like to turn to those reasons now and what they reveal about money and its meanings in early America. The first reason counterfeiters got away with it presents a paradox. Colonial governments needed them, whether they admitted it or not. Though undeniably illicit, moneymakers injected new value into the economic realm, making their activities as generative as real money itself was, crucial to the growing world of trade and markets. In short, counterfeiters were meeting a demand that local assemblies no longer could. Early Americans used every stretch of the imagination to make money plentier. They tore and patched pieces of lower denomination bills of credit to higher, often counterfeited ones. They erased the denominations on genuine bills and pasted newspaper cutouts over the areas. or they drew new bills entirely with a pencil. More experienced counterfeiters printed bills from engraved copper plates, while one Massachusetts housewife used a hot iron and cloth to transfer the ink pattern from a real bill onto blank paper, and then went over the letters with a quill pen to produce the counterfeit seen here. But local governments could also point to counterfeits to bolster their own authority over money matters. After all, no one would try and fake something worthless. Constrained from printing more money, colonial officials used their power of the press to warn the public about counterfeits and detail harsh punishments for moneymakers in colonial newspapers. Some fraudulent bills of credit were described as being done in a very bungling manner, or so wretched clumsily, or so exact that the difference was not easily discovered. In one case, not even the signers of the original bills could discern a counterfeit without comparing it to an authentic piece, while in another, a treasurer had discovered a discrepancy in his accounts only to realize he had unwittingly taken counterfeits in tax payments. And though the punishments were few and far between, already public in nature, they multiplied in print, maximizing public awareness of the counterfeits, the wrongdoers, and the semblance of penal power. Some convicted counterfeiters were themselves forced to circulate. Consider the example of two men found guilty of counterfeiting and sentenced to be carted from town to town, wearing a paper fixed on their back and breast declaring their offense with one of the counterfeit bills fixed thereto. Colonial officials blasted counterfeiting as vile, villainous, wicked, and detestable. One governor likened it to the poisoning the waters of a country, the blackest and most detestable practice that is known, while a minister described it as an open and convict villainy to the unknown wrong of the ignorant and an insult on the government. In other words, counterfeiting didn't just imperil the money supply, but in doing so offended the issuing authority. In reality, counterfeits and counterfeiters mirrored real money and authority more than they threatened it. But no matter what the authorities said, popular opinion was on the counterfeiters' side. And the same accounts reveal conflicting mentalities among elites and commoners. Consider the report of when two men were sentenced to hang for counterfeiting the Massachusetts currency. Most of the gentlewomen of Boston addressed the governor with prayers and tears for their lives, and he was pardoned. Or the story of a Philadelphia man who was convinced to join a counterfeiting ring because he was told that it was no sin, for it would make money plentier among poor people. And when he was publicly whipped a few weeks later, he touched the compassion of the mob, and they did not fling at him snowballs nor anything else. When New York colony executed a counterfeiter in 1756 for the first time, depicted here, the execution had to be postponed because there wasn't a willing hangman to be found. And then again, because the gallows were cut down by persons unknown. Surely such tales provoked more sympathy than outrage, and maybe evoked a moral economy based on the right to eat and community consensus around economic practices. Now, even if they weren't quite the social bandits seen in Robin Hood, historians have shown that counterfeiters enjoyed widespread support at a time of growing popular enthrallment with pirates, highway robbers, and confidence men. Support that reflected a customary value system where economic relations were seen in both moral and practical terms. So that if the authorities neglected to provide an adequate sum of money, commoners seemed to agree that a less official form of currency would have to do. Of course, most counterfeiters weren't caught. To catch a counterfeiter required resources that colonial governments didn't have, such as willing foot soldiers and obviously money for the rewards. And even if they were caught, the prisoners had a decent chance of escaping. Colonial jails regularly allowed visitors, which was how one man accused of counterfeiting the Rhode Island currency managed to escape from a Connecticut jail in his wife's clothes. Together, they had got off his fetters and switched outfits. And when the man called to the keeper to let out his wife, the door being opened, he came out with her apparel and went through a room where was several persons sitting, making them the usual compliments of a woman, and passed off undiscovered. So reported the colonial press. And even if they went to trial, they were likely to be found not guilty, get off on a technicality, or be charged with a lesser crime. Many members of counterfeiting rings signed covenants not to betray each other, like the one described here. So unless a member turned king's witness, a conviction was unlikely. And even if they were convicted, they could pick up and ply their trade elsewhere. Counterfeiters thrived in the fissures of colonial and imperial authority, and those fissures are a second major reason they got away with it. Up until the mid-18th century, most colonies lacked laws making it illegal to counterfeit other colonies' bills of credit, even though most colonies' bills circulated beyond the issuing government by custom or agreement. New Jersey farmers often had little choice but to accept New York and Pennsylvania currency for their crop, while Philadelphia merchants publicly pledged to take Delaware bills. Counterfeiters took advantage of this and other ways paper bills transcended the polities that created them. Massachusetts-based rings made counterfeiting the Rhode Island currency something of a specialty. But Rhode Island was notoriously uncooperative, refusing to offer rewards to informants in other colonies, and suggesting that prosecution costs be borne by the colony where the crime took place and not the one whose currency was forged. Still, not until 1739 did the Massachusetts government finally begin prosecuting colonists for counterfeiting other colonies' bills. Some rings operated in the literal cracks of colonial governance, like the group that set up shop in the Oblong, which was a contested territory along the New York-Connecticut border. Many counterfeits were prepared in the British Isles and brought into the colonies by sailors. And though the importers were sometimes caught and convicted, British counterfeiters of colonial currency operated with virtual impunity. Consider the case of a London printer who had been offered 5 guineas by a New Jersey sailor in exchange for his help making colonial counterfeits. After initially agreeing to the plan, the printer got cold feet and informed the local authorities. But since the sailor couldn't legally be prosecuted in London, they instructed the printer to finish the job as if everything was normal and made him promise to make some private mark to distinguish them from the true ones before notifying the colonial governors of his activities and anticipated arrival in New York City. The last reason counterfeiters got away with it is probably also the most obvious one. Counterfeit currency had become a core part of the colonial monetary landscape. And if it was a core part of the monetary landscape, then it helped structure economic reality. Counterfeits didn't necessarily devalue their authentic counterparts, despite officials' claims that they did. Early Americans who relied on bills of credit for their survival were grateful to get cash to purchase food and fuel, whether it was real or not. Popular indifference to the illegality of counterfeiting reflected the role paper money had come to play in everyday life. The more people used and trusted it, the more likely they were to use and trust counterfeits. Consider that Pennsylvania bills were among the most copied in the colonies because they enjoyed people's trust, even confidently bearing the message to counterfeit is death, similar to the New York bill seen here. But the relationship between a counterfeit and its referent may not have mattered all that much. It didn't matter that the signatures didn't match, or the ink was the wrong color, or the words were misspelled. Instead, the idea that circulation creates value in and of itself may offer a more compelling explanation of counterfeiting practices and culture in early America. And it resonates with anthropological theories of value creation that show the more an object circulates, the higher its value. When the aforementioned New Jersey sailor traveled to London to have his counterfeits made, he explained to the printer that he planned to age the false bills by placing them in a bag with shot and riding with them until they appeared, and this is from the printer's testimony, worn and soiled as though they had been in trade ever since their date of pretended issue. The revelation is striking. What mattered wasn't the precision of the copied seals or signatures that marked authentic bills, but that they looked and felt used. Their social life, not their officialness, made them money. Colonial elites certainly seemed to think so. In 1724, the New Jersey governor justified a recent currency emission by explaining that the constant use of these bills in the market and among common people had destroyed so many of them. And in 1737, a Boston merchant complained that money was so scarce that Massachusetts colonists gladly received Rhode Island's ragged bills, when we have all the reason to believe many of them counterfeits. But it wasn't just the quality of looking and feeling used that made early American money meaningful. So before I gave examples of bills of credit finding meaning in fiscal loops based on spending and taxing, in hierarchical relations based on deference and obligation. I showed the Samuel Sewell account books. And in reciprocal ties based on community and kinship. So unlike these examples, counterfeits seem to accrue value as they circulated through more heterogeneous and geographically dispersed networks, integrating the actions of printers, passers, buyers, and sellers in a process that made systemic meaning. Though single individuals could be successful counterfeiters, the most prolific moneymakers had extensive networks of passers who carried the forgeries to far-off places. They counted on others to supply paper and ink and hide materials, and they hired metal workers who engraved plates for printing. Perhaps over 100 such gangs operated in the British colonies, bringing together people on the margins and people of standing in new ways, and incorporating those from up and down the social scale in an ever-monetizing economy. Counterfeiting rings brought together early Americans from all walks of life, including military officers, ship captains, free and enslaved Black men, goldsmiths and silversmiths, women from all backgrounds, gentlemen, colonial officials, doctors, farmers, laborers, sailors, and tradesmen, carpenters, saddlers, and blacksmiths. Newspaper accounts suggest that most passers assumed humble identities: an Irishman pretending to be a peddler, an escaped British convict who was a jack of all trades. And research on the demographics of counterfeiting rings confirms that many counterfeiters and many more passers came from the margins of colonial society. Now, that's not to say that the profits were evenly distributed, since race and power could influence the outcome. A Black man enslaved in Connecticut was promised his freedom for breaking his counterfeiter enslaver out of jail, only to be caught by the authorities and confiscated with the rest of the counterfeiters' property. Women were valuable members of counterfeiting rings because they were rarely prosecuted, and they went to great lengths to help their menfolk. Mothers, wives, and sisters passed counterfeits, broke their male family members out of jail, and destroyed evidence. One counterfeiter's sister was said to have spread the ink on the plates in the stamping process. So, in short, the spread of counterfeits required numbers and sophistication. And at the core of each counterfeiting collective were the printers. Engravers were paid the most upfront, while passers tended to receive a share of what they passed. I want to move on now to a very specific example of one counterfeiter I was able to trace from New England to New York. So 5 years in the life of a fellow named Joseph Boyce, a 40-something career counterfeiter from Salem, Massachusetts, offer important insight into counterfeiting practices in early America. In 1741, Boyce's crew counted 15 core members spread across the colony, at least 3 of whom were related by blood or kinship. At one point, he enlisted Benjamin Boyce Jr. of Mendon, Massachusetts, to distribute a stack totaling about 15 pounds. When Benjamin, who later turned King's witness, asked Joseph how he came by that money, Joseph replied that he knew where he could get enough of such, but did not tell me plainly that it was counterfeit. But by his hint, I did guess it was so. Over the next few days, Benjamin passed the counterfeits to friends and neighbors, purchasing salt and other things, and even to his father. Meanwhile, Joseph and another counterfeiter, Robert Neal, headed to Cape Cod to print off some more bills. In his testimony taken in winter of 1742, Boyce described how Neal had put off some of the money to a customer, selling him 2 3-pound counterfeits in exchange for an authentic 5-pound bill. Neal told the customer to be careful and not to pass the counterfeits anywhere thereabout, to which he replied that he would take care and pass them far enough off so that they should not be found. Benjamin also testified that Neal had told him that he had gotten the plates for printing the bills in Ireland and got the money struck there and brought it over with him. Well, the authorities managed to apprehend 9 of the gang, but only after a local officer announced a 50-pound per head reward. 8 were tried, convicted, and sentenced to pay large fines or have their ears nailed to the pillory and cut off. By summer, the authorities discovered stacks of counterfeits, plates, and ink in a barn in Lynn, Massachusetts, and arrested 4 more men, including Joseph Boyce, the ringleader, who was convicted and burnt on the hand. Robert Neal was caught in the act in August and confessed that the bills were made and signed in London, and that he had brought over a number with him, which were in a box hid in a rocky place at Salem. He led the authorities to the site, where they unearthed 4 plates and 800 sheets of unsigned bills totaling over 2,500 pounds. So if we believe Benjamin Boyce's testimony, we're left with this picture of colonial counterfeiting where rings overlapped and they intersected so that it wasn't always clear where one ended and the next began. Well, less than 3 years later, Joseph Boyce and his then partner were betrayed by an old comrade and thrown in the Salem jail. When the pair broke out a few days later, a Boston newspaper described them as good-looking, strong, able-bodied men. They made their way to New York undetected, where they set up near the Connecticut border with another of the old gang. By fall of 1744, 2 years later, the governors of New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut were besides themselves over what to do about this new ring. The New York authorities acted the quickest, deposing several people in the gang's orbit. Some witnesses accused a local man of passing counterfeits, but when the officers inquired further, over 20 of his neighbors refused to implicate him, and others retracted the accusations they had previously made. Soon after, the Massachusetts governor wrote to his New York counterpart that he had received information that Joseph Boyce and his partners were living in Dutchess County, where they were deeply concerned in making false bills of credit and passing the same in great parcels for valuable effects. He explained that they were convicted counterfeiters and repeating their crimes again were apprehended but escaped and were wanted in Massachusetts. The informant, a guy by the name of Robert Clark, was called to New York, where he testified that he had been told that a great part of the people of Dutchess County about the oblong were concerned in the making or passing the counterfeit money, and therefore it would be very difficult to get them all away and bring them to justice. Clark eventually revealed that Joseph Boyce and 2 others had cheated him out of money and tried to repay him in counterfeits before convincing him to join the operation as a passer. He reiterated that the gang spread their counterfeits far and wide by constantly sending out their emissaries to distant places, purchasing therewith horses, cattle, and other things of worth to a great value. Whether Clark went to the authorities to escape prosecution or out of revenge, his testimony paints a vivid picture of dense social networks and widespread support. The New York governor issued an arrest warrant for Boyce and his partners, but it was Connecticut officials who surprised the gang just over the colony's border in the very act of using the counterfeit plates, in the middle of a marsh, no less. And they carried Boyce, possibly his 23-year-old son, and another member to the New Haven jail. But even after they extracted a confession and names from the associate, the Connecticut governor was unsure whether the counterfeiters could be tried there. And when Boyce and the snitch inevitably broke jail, the governor's pleas to the neighboring colonies for help went unanswered. Boyce retired after that and lived out his days with his family comfortably in Dutchess County. Counterfeiters expanded their operations in periods of economic depression and in flush times, and at times of political impasse, when local governments struggled the most to meet money demand and when their own authority over money matters eroded. Counterfeiters did what colonial governments couldn't, and in doing so, reinforced and expanded the foundation of the paper money project. But the prevalence of counterfeits also created opportunities for the authorities to distinguish true from false currency and to delineate what they increasingly articulated as their liberty of making money. They did so not in contradistinction to the counterfeiters, who they nevertheless vilified for disturbing peaceful exchange and disrupting public order, but always and often in relation to the British Crown and Parliament. We don't know, or I don't know, when the colonists first evoked liberty to claim a right to make money, but I think it was probably in the 1730s. In 1730, South Carolina colonists praised the king for his goodness, for that unspeakable benefit and liberty of enlarging our currency. In 1734, a Massachusetts writer cried that the colony had been deprived of equal liberty of other colonies, of supplying ourselves with a proper medium of exchange. A 1739 letter to a Boston newspaper editor predicted terrible consequences unless the assembly regained the liberty of making such new emissions as will render taxes easy. In 1744, a Pennsylvania commentator warned that Parliament was planning to put an end to the use of paper money and to take away liberty. And in 1767, in the wake of the Currency Act, the colony instructed its agents in London to tread carefully, while there was the least danger that the assemblies in America must be deprived of the liberty of issuing the bills, which would affect their most valuable rights and privileges. When the colonies declared independence in 1776, it was in defense of liberty and paper money. Agitation for monetary independence, created in part by counterfeiters, preceded and substantiated political independence. And so early America teaches us that money can be a weapon of war, a public claim, or a means of payment. It can liberate and dominate, and it's always enmeshed within matrices of credit and power. But what really gives money meaning then and now are the countless social relations that constitute it. Meaning that is at once specific and systemic, corporeal and abstract, subjective and objective. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Moore, for that wonderful presentation. We have a few minutes for questions and answers. I will start off with a question. Now, I know that to some degree, colonial authorities, quote unquote, accepted the fact that counterfeits existed. But were there ways in the physical bills of credit that they tried to deter counterfeiting at all?
Yeah, and actually there's a great article that came out a few years ago where researchers were actually able to study like the quality and content of Benjamin Franklin's currency from the 1740s and 50s, and they found that like special thread was used. And I mean, we already knew that different ink colors were used. Another way to protect from counterfeiting was to use indentation in some of the earlier bills. So so the earlier bills were indented, so they would actually create a book and then they would cut the bills out of the book so that they would be able to match them back when they collected them through taxes. So yeah, different sort of using different color ink. Leaf prints were also like very popular after the 1720s and 1730s. So you can't really produce a unique leaf print, right? So they did have a lot of physical and material anti-counterfeiting devices. But nevertheless, counterfeiting was extremely prevalent. They tried.
Excellent, thank you. Anyone else have questions? I see some perhaps in the chat.
Yeah. Ralph, if you just want to unmute, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, where are, let's see, what's it? I can get my picture here. There we are. Yeah. Thanks so very much for that, Katie. First of all, I don't want to forget, please be sure to convey my best regards to Beth Dirgesser. And speaking of Beth and people like Beth and people like me, I can't help but see some analogies here with the Roman Empire. But of course, as we know, everything goes back to the Roman Empire anyway, so that should also be no surprise. It's also the case with counterfeiting. The imperial government was very concerned with having the right to issue gold and silver money. I mean, if you try to counterfeit gold or silver, well, let's see, there are basically three penalties: death, death, and death. The government was very blasé, though, about the don't even know whether it was necessary, called counterfeiting, the local issue of little pieces of copper just to deal with local circulation, but will be tied to you if you try to exchange them for gold and silver. So with that background, I've got like a two-part question here. First of all, and I suspect I know the answer, were these bills of credit or paper currency, were they in any way backed up by gold and silver?
Do you want me to answer your first question before you ask?
Oh, yeah, please.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, the short answer is no.
Yeah.
So they were essentially backed by future taxes.
Okay. So with that being the case, then, and I suspected that would be the answer, there's lots of evidence for the counterfeiting of paper money. I mean, if you could pass this off, you talked about it, if it was accepted, if one person accepted it, the next person accepted it, then nobody's the wiser. Are there any recorded attempts or efforts to counterfeit the gold and silver money?
Yeah. So I haven't myself done much research on that. But I think there may have been several like copper counterfeiting rings in the colonies. I'm not sure. I think there probably were attempts to counterfeit gold and yes, there were attempts to counterfeit gold and silver in the colonies because people were tried and convicted and hanged for it. So the penalties were, as you said, much harsher. Other historians have worked on that, so they would know more than me.
Thanks. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions.
Yeah. Thanks.
Jonah, I see you have your hand up. Would you like to unmute and ask?
Sure. Hi, Katie. Thank you for this fantastic talk. I'm really excited to get back into learning a bit about counterfeiting history in colonial America. My question is about the penalties. Why death, right? Like, why is it that the British state and then the colonial agents in the colonies decide that that should be the penalty? Why not make the penalty they start with a particularly high fine or some other sort of use of violence? When you describe the nailing of the ear, you describe other kinds of penalties that were exacted. But I guess I'm curious as to why they took it to such an extreme as to say death is a penalty. Why not use some other form of deterrence as sort of the most, egregious example of penalty?
Yeah. So this is a time when in England, right, they're becoming increasingly strict about crimes against private property, right? So more and more crimes against property are being punishable by death. Making money is a sign of sovereignty, right? So it's not just really a property crime, it's also a crime against the sovereign, right? So that's sort of the simple answer for making counterfeiting punishable by death. And finally, in the colonies, like in the middle of the 18th century, they finally start making counterfeiting bills of credit punishable by death. Initially, it's just counterfeiting coin is punishable by death, and they do that. And there are several convictions in the second half of the 18th century, and they make their way into these sort of criminal autobiographies, which are another sort of way of circulating government power to a wide audience. But yeah, the short answer is that because it's a crime against sovereignty. Not that the colonial assemblies are sovereign in any way, right? But they see themselves as that. And I think actually making counterfeiting punishable by death in the later 18th century is one of their ways of sort of pushing back against Parliament and the Crown. And it's why we can almost see this story as like sort of a prologue to the American Revolution.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jonah.
There's kind of a follow-up question in the chat. How many instances are there of severe punishment, such as hanging or ear amputation, for the crime? So I guess how often did this happen versus even those who are caught not being put to death or anything like that?
So I would say that more people were found not guilty or let off on technicalities, right? Because counterfeiting, you get a trial by jury, right? And this is something with popular support. So juries were very loath to put counterfeiters to death because it wasn't really seen as a crime of blood, right? It wasn't a crime against someone's person. So as I mentioned before, in the second half of the 18th century, there are several instances of counterfeiters being put to death. I don't know the number off the top of my head. I haven't determined how many people were actually received corporal punishment. But that's a good question. So now I want to go through all the newspapers and identify how many people actually were, nailed to the pillory or were burned in the hand. But we didn't see any counterfeiters put to death for paper currency until the second half of the 18th century.
It kind of goes
That's a
back
good
to what
question.
you were saying earlier about your social standing in society and maybe even who sort of thing. I'm sure. In fact, I came across there's actually a theft that occurred in the East Jersey Treasury in 1768 that uncovered a huge counterfeiting ring. And the only person put to death was one of the passers, because the actual counterfeiters was like the son of a judge and so on and so forth. And they were essentially let go. So it is, like you were saying, kind of who you know and who you are.
I mean, really prominent colonists were involved in these rings. Signers of the people who signed the original bills of credit were sometimes involved in the rings, like prominent goldsmiths, John Potter of Rhode Island. So it really did bring together people from across the social spectrum in these sort of new ways.
We have a question here. A very early image, possibly from Pennsylvania, mentioned a counterfeiter who was whipped and cropped. Do you happen to know the meaning of cropped? This was answered by another viewer here, to cut the ear off, crop the ear essentially. But I guess I have a follow-up to this are there any other kind of punishments that are similar to that? Not put to death, but whipped, cropped. Is there anything else? I think you mentioned branding, right?
Yeah, branding on the hand. Yeah, so being marked, right? Being marked publicly, just kind of like these counterfeiters marked bills of credit, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so counterfeiters would often be found of passing instead of counterfeiting, so that they wouldn't be put to death, right? And so then they would receive these lesser sentences of having the ear cut off or receiving a branding on the hand.
There's a very famous person who made both legitimate and non-legitimate numismatic objects, Abel Buell, who was caught counterfeiting by changing lower denominations into higher denominations. And he was a respected member of society. So they cropped his ear, but only like half of it. And then they branded his forehead, but they put it high enough up so that they can cover it with his hair still. So they marked him, but kind of let him get away with it to some degree as well. Eric, you have your hand up? We may have lost Eric. He'll
Hi,
probably
can
come
you hear
back.
me now?
Yes, we
Sorry,
can
I
hear
had my mute on. On the one hand, there's this discussion of these cases of punishments and people who are caught, and it becomes rather lurid at times. But there was the other point about the stimulatory effect that these counterfeits had on the economy, and that there were networks of people who were enabled economically who otherwise might not have been. And it makes me think of, in the present day, the cash economy and people who work off the books, and the effect that this has on generating activity in business. Is there any rough idea what percentage of the economy consisted of these counterfeits back in the 18th century? Just a rough ballpark idea, 10%, 2%, 20%?
If I had to guess, because I don't know the answer, I would say 20%, just because the few rings that they uncovered, I mean, sometimes it was, it was thousands of pounds, right? And any given emission of paper currency by a colonial assembly ranged from, 5,000 pounds to 30,000 pounds. So these are significant numbers. We don't know if all of the counterfeits entered into circulation, right? Because a lot of these rings were found with counterfeits stashed away, right? So probably even more counterfeits were made than even got out there. But based on what people were saying at the time, one of the arguments that pro paper money, politicians and pamphleteers were making is that, well, we need money, and that's why people are accepting counterfeits. So I think that sort of suggests what you were saying, right? That it did stimulate the economy. It did give people money to sort of
So,
pay for their necessities.
so there's a kind of a tension between the need to stamp it out and the risk that you stamp it out, you murder 20% of your economy.
Yeah, the need to stamp it out versus the need for money
Right, right.
that they can't always provide based on what's happening in colonial politics or imperial politics at the time.
Thank you.
We have a question from Roger Moore. Similar to currency in colonies, lotteries were a key way to raise money. Did you find instances of lottery tickets being counterfeited?
I haven't focused on that in my research, but I'm inclined to say that there were, um, especially later in the 18th century. I tend to focus on the earlier part of the century. Um, that's a great question. I'm going to go find out.
Another question from the chat. Can you say something about the denominations of these bills?
Yeah. So counterfeits, like authentic bills of credit, ranged in denomination from very, very low denomination to not even that high. Well, 5 pounds is a bit high, I guess. But yeah, they varied, and I think the tendency was to produce counterfeits that were of a lower denomination, right? Because it's less suspicious. You can kind of get away with more. But you also had examples, and I think Jesse, you even mentioned this, people, cutting up bills and pasting them to higher denomination bills, or erasing the denominations on lower denomination bills to make them higher denomination bills. So they varied as much as the authentic bills, really. And it was very easy to turn, certain numbers on an authentic bill into a higher number.
Indeed. That's all the questions we have from the chat. Everyone is more than welcome to put more there, or Lawrence Edwards, I see you have your hand up.
Okay, thanks. So all of this strikes me as very, well, a lot of it similar to, say, what was happening in Britain with the issuing of private tokens that circulated as cash because the crown was not providing small change in that case. So it is a question of sovereignty, but also the competition of private producers intervening in the economy, and then a second question that occurred to me is that I guess more during the Revolutionary War, the British government itself, was it not, was counterfeiting American notes and trying to flood the colonies in order to undermine local economies as a strategy of war that is known in other times and places as well.
Yeah, they did. They counterfeited the continental currency, which didn't hold its value that well anyway, and it was very closely tied to military victories and defeats, how the war was going, right? Not everyone supported the War of Independence, so you didn't really have like the communal consensus behind continental currency that you did behind bills of credit of the colonial era. And I think that's why it was that much easier for the British to undermine confidence in the continental currency. And yeah, it's so the sovereignty versus private currency question. The colonies, there were shopkeepers and there were merchant collectives that did try to issue private bills, I guess similar to the trade tokens of Britain at the same time. But because of the system that had been in place since, going back to 1690, colonial assemblies tried very hard to stamp out that private competition. Like more so than they did counterfeits of authentic currency. They made arguments that, well, private bills, because oftentimes these merchant collectives would, they would gather up gold and silver and they would back them with gold and silver. And so it would lead to these major fluctuations in value, and it would end up undermining the value of the official currency. So they tried very hard to keep these private currencies at bay. The one sort of exception is the Massachusetts Land Bank of 1740, which was so popular and was so successful because by that point, Parliament had already intervened in the Massachusetts currency. They had basically told them to rein it in and start retiring it forever. And so you do have this sort of popular movement to establish a land bank issuing paper currency that is a private currency, but that nevertheless still requires a charter from the colonial government. But yeah, there's a lot in like the political pamphlets of the day that are talking about these merchants notes, store credit, shopkeeper tokens, and for the most part, it's anti those private tokens because they see them as undermining this official currency that they see as working quite well.
All right, we're back at the top of the hour. If there are no more questions that you're just dying to ask right now, we'll wrap it up. Ryan, do you know what is happening? Ryan has a question.
I have lots of questions, but Katie, thank you so much for just such an incredible just talk. I wanted to ask, can you remind us the title of your book, please? Because I would love to go read in this more depth.